Rove, rove, rove your boat gently as you stream. Wuthering, 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 wuthering combat, such a dream. Yes, you heard it right. The combat is such a dream with how seamless the gameplay is. Makes me want to get a well-rested long sleep longer than how others would sleep on this game. At first glance, it has some obnoxious UI bugs as well as the absurdly frequent recurrence of the pre-recording of Huanglong. And if I have to be honest, I wasn't sold with the intro. So I thought to myself, that was it? Until I set up to combat, and boy oh boy, I am now enlightened on why this game is being highly acclaimed by many content creators. To think that in Genshin I would need to press Alt plus the key binding for a character in a certain slot for a somehow smooth transition, especially during iframes, and now I don't need to be at risk of molding because of internet delay. I can just press those numbers and still chain my attacks while switching characters. It's like playing BlazBlue, Guilty Gear, Tekken, and all the fighting games in ultra easy brain-dead mode, where you can just perform a move sequence with a single button. But I would only be half-assing this video if I would only talk about the satisfaction aspect of the combat. Because seriously, there is a lot to be amazed over. Thanks to my past elective game dev lessons, I can share some insights on why I, as well as other combat hype creators, go crazy on this game's combat. Welcome to the first episode of Deep Dive, where we dive deep into what makes Wuthering Waves' combat so special. As a preface, I will be making references on game design topics as well as the subject of game theory. Not the YouTube channel, but the area of study. So I will be going over concepts like the MDA framework, which stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics, which I believe would encapsulate much of what I want to highlight about Wuthering Waves' combat. On a personal note, I've been enjoying my gameplay experience with this game. It's like you get to play a hack-and-slash game with open-world exploration that takes parkour on a different level of Assassin's Creed. Not to mention that the graphics, switch combat visuals, echoes, and the dodge counter parry visuals remind me a lot of Final Fantasy 15. It feels really nostalgic that you get to bring back the vibes of different games you love in a combined combat dynamic. And in my opinion, Wuthering Waves' combat has been the liveliest combat system I've had in such a long time. Controls-wise, I'm in some sort of a limbo trying to decide if I prefer Wuthering Waves' key control mapping. Because on one hand, there's me feeling weirded out with the sequencing of controls given that I'm transitioning from my Genshin combat gameplay where I press Q for the ultimate. So I often use my echo skill when I intend to use my active character's ultimate instead. Then on the other hand, there's me feeling satisfied because back in Genshin, I've been dying to change the key binding for the elemental burst from Q to R because I used to be a QWER player, so I'm used to pressing R to cast my ultimate. I'm not sure if now Genshin allows a change in key binding for those controls, but I'm low-key glad that Wuthering Waves had R for the ultimate. You know, because R stands for Resonance Liberation. Now that got me thinking, which keybind would you then at least prefer for ultimates, Q or R? Let me know in the comments below. Going back to the topics of controls and keybinds, it's quite easy to transition from Genshin combat to Wuthering Waves' combat because they both use the same WASD movement controls. Shift or right click for dash, hold it to sprint, space to jump, space midair to deploy gliders, shift midair to aerial dash, T to use your module. If you had the grappler module, then it's pretty much your MVP in exploration and combat in some cases. Q for echo, E for skill, R for ultimate, F for picking up, you know the others. Whatever was shown to you by the tutorials are likely similar to Genshin in terms of controls. But let's be honest, most of us won't have the patience to read through tutorials, and even if we do, we won't have the patience to let it sink for us to know what is going on with that specific tutorial. Yet, when we look at the player's favorite aspect of a game, it all boils down to combat. What they feel about it, what the graphics are like, how smooth it feels like, and all those user experience factors. That might have explained that one finding I read about where developers would work from the mechanics that give context to the dynamics, which derives the aesthetics, while the player would perceive the aesthetics first, which encourages them to delve into the dynamics, which would be a natural result of mastering the mechanics. The controls we discussed a while ago make up for the mechanics aspect of the game. Oftentimes, this is derived under the genre in which the game falls under. Is it a 2D platformer that makes use of arrow keys and space? Is it a fighting game that makes use of different key bindings that you can change according to your personal preferences? Is it a shooter where you make use of the WASD movement and numbers to switch weapons? Is it a rhythm game where you pretty much use 2 keys or more in your keyboard while moving your mouse? The thing is, Wuthering Waves falls under the same category as Genshin in the sense that they're both open world that makes use of a single on-fielded character amongst multiple characters in a deployed team, which can be switched from time to time. Okay, that was a little complicated to explain the genre, but you catch the drift. So it's no doubt that mechanics is what makes the basics, or rather the foundation of a game, let alone a game's combat system. But if you evaluate Wuthering Waves' combat system through the lens of mechanics, you might think that, the combat is pretty normal? Maybe the ecosystem is what makes it special? But I also wouldn't say so for that case alone. All you get from using your echo skill is pretty much an extra ability to aid you in combat, if we are talking about the mechanics. Now, let me talk about aesthetics. And by aesthetics, we don't mean just beauty or design or mood boards and great layout. What aesthetics means here is the kind of response that is elicited from the player given the dynamics. But before you ask, oh, why didn't Merc go over dynamics first? Why is our guy speedrunning his way to aesthetics? Well, here's the thing. I am also looking at Wuthering Waves as a player, and I said a while ago that players tend to perceive the aesthetics aspect first. I discussed the mechanics first to cover the fundamental pieces of the combat system that would later make the point as to why the combat is great for this game. So, as I said about aesthetics, this game has garnered a reputable feedback in regards to the smoothness of its combat and its interactivity. And personally, I gave my share of opinion about how the reminiscent vibes of the aforementioned games were condensed in this game's combat gameplay experience. However, I also expressed my initial thoughts about how I wasn't sold about the intro, and of course there would also be other players who see this game as not their cup of tea. Those are different motives, where you'd see the different types of players in a specific player base, like someone who plays for the meta, someone who plays for the vibe, someone who plays for co-op, someone who plays for waifu, someone who plays for the music, the lore, and many more. These correspond to 8 different types of aesthetics, namely sensation, fantasy, narrative, challenge, fellowship, discovery, expression, and submission. But since we are on the topic of combat, the people who like this game in that regard would also be the type of players who play for the combat. Smooth, interactive, fluid. Those are among the many keywords that are used to point towards the X factor of the combat system. Now, the question is, which type of aesthetic does the combat gravitate around? The answer would be sensation, where a game invokes sense pleasure. There are many games that shine in this area, many with varying genres and mechanics. But if we narrow down to the related games like Genshin, Wuthering Waves has done a great attempt at providing a fresh upgrade to the combat gameplay experience. For instance, when you parry successfully, you notice how gameplay time slows down drastically. And every time you parry consistently, it evokes that feeling of satisfaction and that in-your-face confirmation that I deflected the attack. It's because it makes use of hit stops, which is often seen in games where there are momentary zoom-ins, slow-mo, added effects, and even freeze frames that come simultaneously when there is collision or hitting involved. Going back to the case of parrying, it's a perfect demonstration of how hit stops contribute to combat interactivity. What's more is that it wasn't only done for the finesse, but rather it blends well to what the game combat is designed for. The same use of hit stops can also be seen when you break enemy toughness. As straightforward as it looks, it still contributes to the player's engagement in combat. Since combat is pretty fast-paced, it's fundamentally easier to get lost in mindless switching and button mashing under the constraints of cooldowns. But with the slow motion effects in combat, it makes it welcoming for the players to perform their preferred bread-and-butter combo with their selected team characters. Look at dodging. Sometimes when you dodge, you also get to follow up an attack as a form of dodge counter. If the gameplay time just goes on as it is, the counter vibe wouldn't be as noticeable as it is if it were in slow-mo. Plus, it's also another satisfying feedback that when you dodge successfully, the game visually makes you feel that "not even close, baby" sensation. We also get some characters' intro and outro skills. For this one, Encore would be a great example because when you switch her in and her intro skill is up, you would get a slow-mo of Encore midair before plunging down to the ground. And speaking about her skill, anticipation is also one factor that makes combat appealing for this game. Like with dodging, there is a player-oriented transition where it depends on the inputted move if the dodge will transition to a dodge counter, and this just happens seamlessly during the anticipation. There are surely other characters that also do this, and there are also variations of these intro and outro skills, but that simple addition of intro-outro skills in between switching makes switching a matter of grand entrances and grand exits. Then you also have this concluding hit stop where everything is super highlighted when you defeat a boss for the first time. There's another subtle thing about this game's aesthetics factor that is also worth considering. I brought up other games that strike a resemblance in my perspective when I was playing the game. And to explain the connection with an example, let's use Genshin Impact. Again, at first, what do you think led people to try out Genshin after release? Is it because of the fact that it's an open-world game that looks like Breath of the Wild? Is it because of the fact that it's made by the same company who made Honkai Impact 3rd? Is it because of the fact that it has anime-style graphics? The thing is, there are quite a lot of people who picked up Genshin because of its resemblance to other games or its connection to the developers behind it. If Hoyoverse works on a new game in which ZZZ is on the lookout, a lot of people would try it out because of Hoyoverse's reputation with its games. Similar case to when Wuthering Waves came out, or even Tower of Fantasy that turned out short-lived. People picked them up because of their preferences for these open-world gacha games. You see, it could also be a franchise-related thing, and that if you're a long fan of the Zelda games and you've been playing Breath of the Wild, chances are you must have already heard of Genshin and even got yourself to pick it up because of the resemblance. This then tackles another type of aesthetics, which is submission, which is a certain connection that the player has towards the game, mostly due to preferences. And if you go back to Wuthering Waves, the combat resembles that of a hack-and-slash game. Personally, I like the vibe of hack-and-slash games, and so if I picked up Wuthering Waves for that reason and ended up enjoying it, there's that element of submission due to that hack-and-slash resemblance. Same can be said if I ended up loving the ecosystem due to its resemblance to Final Fantasy summons. Same can also be said for people who picked this up because it's developed by the same company who developed Punishing Grey Raven. So now that we've covered the factors that makes Wuthering Waves combat an exciting experience for the upcoming players, let's move on to the central point of where the game's combat's uniqueness lies, the dynamics. Dynamics here refers to the outputs generated by the interplay of the mechanics and the inputs of the player. Choices, constraints, consequences, chances are some of the factors that fall under dynamics. Combat in-game is not really all about left-clicking or using skills. Games with multiple installments often have variety in their combat systems, with each individual game having its own independent gimmick. Gimmicks range from a different gameplay feature to a need for proficiency in a specific mechanic. Most often, different gimmicks can be seen in cases where the game has diverse environments and levels. But for Wuthering Waves, let's use two bosses as an example, the Phalian Beringal and the Inferno Rider. When you fight the Phalian Beringal, you might be presented a chance where it does the shockwave attack. Of course, this prompts you to jump and stay midair to avoid taking damage. But you can also choose to face tank it if you're confident that your resonator won't die. You can also try to iframe it. These are within the bounds of the choices and consequences on the part of the player. If the player is trying to do a no damage challenge with the Phalian Beringal, getting hit by an attack becomes a constraint on its own. But many other games has this? What makes Wuthering Waves special in that regard then? If we go back to the possible choices a player can go for when the Phalian Beringal uses the shockwave attack, they can opt to jump preemptively. Then they stay midair by doing a midair dash or using the grappler module. That is, taking into account the no damage constraint. But if let's say we are fighting the Inferno Rider where there isn't a certain move that punishes you for not going midair, it's not like the grappler module is automatically obsolete or staying midair would end up useless. In fact, I often go midair and use the grappler module during combat. If you're thinking about doing a plunge attack, then that's also not the primary reason because you can just do a plunge attack from a single jump. If you notice, there are certain characters whose attacks interact varyingly in midair. Take Verina for example. She can do her normal attack string midair. And if you want her to plunge down, you'd have to input her heavy attack. We're no strangers to character switching, but have you ever managed to switch characters midair? Like after using Verina's midair normal attack string, you use the grappler module to stay up in the air and then switch to encore to plunge back down? Oh, and what if instead of encore, you switch to a character who can also attack midair? That's pretty much a lot of midair action. The thing is, Wuthering Waves' combat took the term open world on a different level because they allowed the players to make the most out of the midair state. And if you notice, when you command a plunge down move and then abruptly switch to a character during the plunge animation, it doesn't interrupt the plunge and it lets the switched out character finish the move while you're controlling the current active one at the same time. This does not only apply for plunging attacks. You can also notice this with heavy attacks, with skills, and even with echo skills under the right timing. The game doesn't penalize you for switching at the wrong time, and for the player, this is a good thing because it allows players to test more interactions with the game's combat mechanics. The reason why it's interactive is because the game doesn't have too many constraints around the combat controls and environment, which encourages the players to feel the combat itself. The reason why it's smooth and fluid is because it doesn't interrupt attacks when animations are buffered. And speaking about fluidity, there is the intro-outro skill, which by itself stands alone as part of the dynamics. It doesn't need extra controls or input for the skill to take effect, it just happens automatically upon switching. This feature incentivizes players to make use of switching as a core part of their combat gameplay, especially since switch cooldowns are independent per character. And that same incentivization falls under the scope of dynamics. If consequences influence player behavior to be more cautious, incentivization influences player behavior to go with the flow of their own choices. With the intro-outro skill being automatic, switching feels more like an attack string or a continuation for a combo rather than a transition for a team rotation. And when you have these dynamics accompanied by the right choice of aesthetics, it makes a perfect combination for a smooth combat experience. There have been remarks about Kuro games being player or community oriented, and we can really see it here. By prioritizing the player perspective, the combat was defined by the seamless meshing of its satisfying aesthetics and its less constraining dynamics. With fewer unnecessary constraints, players have more choices in regards to their real-time combat gameplay experience. This reduces player frustration while maintaining the balance between stress or difficulty and fun for optimal player experience. After all, this only proves that improvement isn't a matter of adding a bunch of gimmicks. Sometimes it better helps to remove some of the constraints to allow the interplay of individual mechanics to flow naturally. All in all, Wuthering Waves saw how it could utilize the mid-air environment and switching to provide a seamless combat experience, and the positive player remarks were thanks to their incorporation of the suitable mechanics matched with a great blending of its dynamics. In summary, Wuthering Waves took advantage by laying out its fundamental mechanics to introduce newer features in their style of combat, making the most basic of the controls straightforward. With players being able to grasp most of the combat mechanics, the game provides them a more dynamic and interactive combat experience by removing constraints and making full use of smooth transitions in the open world environment. As players engage more into the satisfying combat experience that the game provides, the game also supplements this experience by putting visual accompaniment as well as eye-catching animations, such as hit stops, slow-mo, and anticipation to provide sensational pleasure feedback to the player, which then establishes a feedback loop. As the game satisfies the player with its visuals and animations, the player is more compelled to play its combat, and the more the player engages with the combat, the game provides more of its smooth experience on a consistent basis. For the case of upcoming and new players, Wuthering Waves also has its respective resemblance that could draw in players that come from specific genres, graphic styles, and developers of other relevant games. And that concludes our deep dive for this video. Personally, I'm liking the combat and I thought it would be interesting to brainstorm the reason behind this game's immense hype. Not to mention the fact that I used to review and critique games in the past as part of my elective game dev classes. So this also became an opportunity for me to apply my knowledge from topics that are outside of your conventional gacha games. If I missed anything or if you at least have additional thoughts you'd wish to consider, drop it down in the comments. Insights are always appreciated. If you like this deep dive episode, you can always turn to the oratrice mécanique d'analyse cardinale to render the subscribe verdict for more episodes. Stay tuned for newer waters to dive into. With that, I'll see you at least in the next video. Au revoir.